Hey there, welcome to APUS. It's me, Miss Terrell. Hi. Here I am in OA 13, and today we're going to talk about the planting of English America and basically look at each of the 13 colonies, kind of break them down a little bit. Um, so to start off, obviously there were some early attempts by England to colonize America. Sir Humphrey Gilbert attempted to colonize the coast of Newfoundland. Unfortunately, he died at sea, so it didn't work out too hot for old Mr. Gilbert. Sir Walter Raleigh landed and colonized Roanoke Island off the coast of Virginia. Of course, the Roanoke colony ended in total disaster. England really emerges as a dominant world power at the time, and they begin to spread their wings, kind of imperialism, and spread out and conquer more domain rather, because the more land you have, the bigger your empire is, and the more power you have. In your reading, you might find the term joint stock company. This allowed for a number of investors to pool their money together and set out on an adventure. There weren't a lot of people that had enough money to, pay for labor, boats, materials to get across and start building, etc. So more people came together, pooled their assets, and were able to head out. One of these first early colonies was Jamestown. You might have heard of this before. Uh, Jamestown comes out of a venture by the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company out of London, which received a charter from King James I to create a settlement in the New World. Of course, they were looking for gold. Everyone's looking for gold and riches. And they were also looking for an easier passage from America to the Indies. The Virginia Company charter was very important. It guaranteed that overseas settlers had same rights as Englishmen did. They would have the same rights essentially in the New World as they did in England. Jamestown, of course, was the beginning of a nightmare. 40 people died between 1606 and 1607. The exhibition in 1609 had their priorities out of whack. They were there looking for gold, looking for treasures. They didn't realize that they were going essentially to an absolutely beautiful, natural resource rich location, but they were looking for gold, and they just didn't have the skill set they needed to survive this kind of environment. John Smith, whose name might sound familiar to you from the story of Pocahontas, his bumper sticker would be, "He who shall not work shall not eat," and essentially he helps to save the Jamestown colony. But prior to him, many settlers, the early settlers of Jamestown, died. They were reduced to eating dogs, cats, and even digging up corpses of settlers that had passed for food. There's a great story, well, it's not great, it's kind of morbid, about a guy who digs up his wife who passed away, salts her body meat, and eats it, and of course is executed for doing that. Rightly so, I would assume. But again, these people weren't there to build a colony. They were there to find gold and treasures. So their priorities are definitely out of whack. Those that did end up surviving tried to make it back to England. However, they're turned around and forced back to the dying colony. By 1625, Virginia did contain about 1,200 survivors who tried to make it in the New World. Of course, varying degrees of interaction with the native, as mentioned, in most cases didn't shake out so well. Relations were tense as the English looked down on the Indians as inferior beings. The English were looking for gold and land and wanted to increase their empire. They really weren't looking for anybody to get in their way. One of the first real colonies settled is Virginia, and John Rolfe, who actually was married to Pocahontas, pretty much becomes the economic savior of Virginia. by perfecting a method of growing and harvesting and curing tobacco. Europeans go nuts for tobacco, and it becomes an item that's high in demand, essentially becomes a cash crop. And the colonists living in Virginia at the time grow it everywhere. I mean, they grow it in the streets, they grow it in between grave headstones, they grow it, they fill up water troughs and plant it in the water troughs. It's just everywhere. Tobacco, like I said, becomes a cash crop. However, there's some downsides to growing tobacco. It is very hard on the soil, and these colonists, they don't exactly know what they're doing. They're growing enough and making a profit, but they're also ruining the soil and over processing and working the soil. So it becomes a bit of an issue. It's not overly sustainable. Growers also become greedy. The price of tobacco fluctuates. So some years you're making a lot of money, some years you're not making a lot of money. So it's kind of a iffy situation. Slavery also has its roots in Virginia, starting as far back as 1619, paying for people to be your enslaved labor force, paying for them, not paying them. By 1650, there's about 300 African slaves living and working in Virginia. We'll talk about that more extensively later. Virginia also sets up a representative self-government, which is essentially born in Virginia in 1619. They set up something called the House of Burgesses, which is a representative parliamentarian assembly created to govern Virginia. It's established a precedent for government in the rest of the English colonies. James I, the King of England at the time, hated tobacco. He hated the House of Burgesses. He becomes somewhat annoyed with Virginia and essentially revokes the Virginia Company charter in 1624 and makes Virginia a royal colony directly under his control. So he can completely have them under his thumb and dictate what happens there. Another colony we'll talk about is Maryland. It's the fourth English colony set up in 1634 by Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore comes from a prominent English Catholic family. He's looking to get out of England because he and other Catholics are being persecuted by Protestants. He's also obviously looking for financial profit. Maryland is another colony that prospers by growing tobacco, and they become dependent on indentured servants, which are people who are sponsored by wealthy farmers to come to the colony, and in doing so, they will work off their passage. And we're going to start, we will talk more extensively about this and look at some primary documents about indentured servitude. Interesting fact, characteristic of Maryland, they passed something called the Act of Toleration in 1649, which guarantees toleration to all Christians, but decreed the death penalty for those like Jews and atheists who denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. The Act of Toleration ensured that Maryland would continue to attract a high proportion of Catholic immigrants throughout the colonial period. So they wanted to keep up their population. New England in general, we're going to look at the New England colonies, start with Rhode Island, which was founded by Roger Williams, who at the time was a well-respected Puritan minister. He went to Massachusetts, like other people, looking for some freedoms, looking for a new world, looking to inhabit the new world. He was also going to preach and escape, some of the religious persecutions that were happening in England. When he got to Massachusetts, however, there was a conflict of interests in his belief system, which was a little different from other prominent Puritan pastors or reverends or pastors at the time. So he ends up being actually banished from the colony. And he decides to set out, and he settles Providence, which is located capital of Rhode Island, in 1636. Providence is pretty unique because they recognized the rights of American Indians and also paid them for the use of their land. The government also allowed Catholics, Quakers, and Jews to worship freely. And Roger Williams himself founded one of the first Baptist churches in America right in Providence. Connecticut, Hartford is founded in 1636 by Thomas Hooker. They drew up the first written constitution in American history called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which set up a representative government elected by popular vote and a governor chosen by that legislature. New Hampshire, the last colony to be founded in New England in 1679, becomes a royal colony and is appointed a governor. Headed down south, looking at North Carolina, farmers in New England and Virginia established small self-sufficient tobacco farms spotted throughout North Carolina. There were very few large plantations and didn't really need a lot of reliance on slavery because the farms were relatively small. North Carolina did foster a democratic view and autonomy from British control. South Carolina, founded in 1670, initially was based on trading furs and providing food for the West Indies, but by the mid-18th century became a very large rice-growing community, set up large rice-growing plantations, which all eventually began to be worked by slaves. Headed up to New York, which is where I'm from. New York was originally a Dutch colony, but forcefully taken over in 1664 by the Duke of York. And he also ordered that the colony be renamed New York. New Jersey, large tracts of land were offered to people at generous prices and sometimes even free. New Jersey also promised religious freedoms and an assembly form of government, and they were hoping to attract more people to go there, which eventually they did, but it was a smaller colony at the time of its founding. Pennsylvania, super interesting history in Pennsylvania. Essentially was a pretty extensive religious experiment and also pretty cool. Quakers, in case you don't know, is a religious group known as the Religious Society of Friends. They believed in equality in all men and women. They preach nonviolence, and they also practice a strong resistance to military service. They believe that religious authority is found within the person's soul and not in the Bible and outside sources. So to Puritans, Protestants, etc., this is really kind of very radical views, and the Quakers were shunned and persecuted daily. Quakers of England were often persecuted and jailed for their beliefs, so they decided to head to America, and they did so under the eye of William Penn, who was from a wealthy family. He was granted a large piece of land from his father, and William set up what was known as the, quote, Holy Experiment, which provided religious refuge for Quakers and other persecuted people. Essentially, the Holy Experiment enacted liberal ideals of government in Pennsylvania. He also wanted to generate profit and income for himself. He set up what was known as the Frame of Government in 1682, which guaranteed a representative assembly elected by landowners and a written constitution which granted freedom of worship for all and unrestricted immigration. So anyone could go to Pennsylvania. Pretty cool. Georgia is the last of the 13 colonies to be established here in the New World in 1732, and it is totally different than the rest of the colonies. It received direct financial support from the government of England, and it became the place where England would send their prisoners who were living in overcrowded jails. So instead of having overcrowded jails, they would send the prisoners over to Georgia. And the person that was in charge of this at the time was a man named James Oglethorpe, and he founded Savannah in 1773, set up strict restrictions in the colony, no drinking, no slavery, No, they had to be indoors at a certain time. The colony did not prosper because of constant threat by the Spanish.